Thank you once again for joining. Um, Today, I'm joined by a very well known guest. I'm with Dr. Ruth Bottigheimer, who is a respected scholar of fairy tales, folklore, and children's literature. She has taught and researched at leading universities, including Princeton, Oxford, and Cambridge, and has been hailed as one of America's foremost Grimm scholars. She has written important studies on the Brothers Grimm, children's Bibles, and the history of book illustration. Her book, Fairy Tales New History, argues that many fairy tales began as written stories in cities rather than old oral tales passed down by peasants. She has also explored the history of the Arabian Nights, which makes her especially well placed to talk about Sinbad and how his adventures connect with wider traditions of storytelling and cultural exchange. So, with me today is Dr. Ruth. Good evening for you and good morning for me, I suppose.
Good, good evening to you, and thank you for your very generous introduction. It'll be a pleasure to talk with you about Sinbad the Sailor stories.
Excellent. So, first and foremost, who is Sinbad the Sailor in the simplest of terms?
In the simplest of terms, Sinbad the Sailor is a young man who has inherited a fortune from his father, and he has squandered it pretty completely, and decides he's got to repair his fortunes by going to sea and engage in foreign trade. He has many adventures.
So, where do Sinbad's adventures take place, and what kind of world would you say he lives in?
Sinbad's adventures take place all in islands in unnamed oceans, far, far away. Where he lives when he's not on his adventures is in Baghdad. Well, Baghdad, the setting is Baghdad under Harun al-Rashid.
Um, in your estimation, how old are the Sinbad stories, and where do they first appear?
Well, this is not my estimation, but the estimation of scholars in general. And there's a lot that is not known about the Sinbad manuscripts and the history of the Sinbad stories, but there's a lot that is known too. The stories come to us from the 7th, 8th, ninth. Let me put that, sorry, 7, 8, and 900 years ago, approximately. So that means we're talking about the 12th, 13th, 14th, 15th centuries.
So, originally, as I understand, these tales weren't part of the Arabian Nights.
Oh, that way they weren't actually. The Sinbad stories existed independently for, well, hundreds of years, and they were not being told by Scheherazade. They were being told by someone else, someone named Sinbad the Porter. They were put into the Arabian Nights only in 1704 when Antoine Galland included the 7 voyages of Sinbad in volume 3 of his 12-volume translation and extension of the 1001 Nights.
Just out of curiosity, why do you think these stories were actually included into the Arabian Nights?
By Galland, well, that has to do with what was going on in Galland's own life. He was living the life of a precarious life of an independent scholar, which means he was not independent at all because he came from a poor family. He lived from the largesse of patrons, and he was, uh, at the time he first learned about the Sinbad stories, he was working outside Paris, and he translated the stories as relaxation in the evening. He was going to publish them separately, but then he got hold of the Arabian Nights, a manuscript that is now known as the oldest one available, in the and the most complete. And he simply inserted them into volume 3. Don't ask me why. He had plenty of stories at hand, but he had them had translated them already, and it may just have been a very human one to clear his desk. I don't know, but that's what happened. The first 4 volumes were published in 1704, and Sinbad was in volume 3.
Awesome. Uh, how many voyages does Sinbad take, and why are they important?
Well, he takes 7 voyages, and he has taken 7 voyages for several centuries. Uh, what does that have? Why 7? And here I'll speculate, and as uh, pure speculation, and that is that stories stories in the time at which this collection was first put together were often owned by libraries, and they were lent out or rented out to readers, and they rented out to readers who told the stories, read the stories aloud in places that men gathered, or they might be told at family gatherings, parties. But this has all the marks of something that somebody was hired for a period of days to tell, one voyage a day. At that time, the Arab world was like the Western world, was living on a week calendar, 7 days a week, perhaps, but that's speculation.
Interesting. So, as I understand it, even the Iranian playwright Bahram Beyzeh, I believe that's his name, he wrote a play about the eighth voyage.
Yes. Well, if you have a classic that's 7 voyages and always 7 voyages, it really does excite one to think, well, what might the 8th voyage have been like or about? And you can imagine yourself any number of directions in which somebody might want to take an 8th voyage for Sinbad. And that's what that playwright did. Yes, you're quite right about that.
So, for those of us who are not so well acquainted with the Sinbad tales, what actually happens on the first voyage?
Okay, here's the action of the very first voyage that Sinbad takes. He takes ship with some other merchants, and they land on a beautiful island, unspecified, but it must be far from Basra. And this island, after days on a ship with only water and the sky to look at, here's an island, trees, bushes, greenery. They're so delighted. The men jump off the ship, uh, that's what it says. And they go around gathering fruits and vegetables, and then eventually they build of some cooking fires to make supper. And the island starts to move, and the captain, realizing that this is not an island, but a large something that's about to sink under the sea, gets back on the ship, and so do some of the sailors who never got off. But everyone else who got off the ship drowns except for Sinbad. And he sees the ship sailing off, and he also sees a wooden tub that he climbs into and lands on a nearby island. And what he sees, the second part of the first voyage, is a kind of resolution, but starts mysteriously. He sees a female horse tied to a post, uh, and very soon after he notices this, a male horse comes out of the waves. It's a horse from the sea, not a seahorse, but a horse from the sea, and mounts her and fertilizes her, right? And so, and then the horse runs off and goes back to sea. Soon after that, a man appears. Uh, Sinbad goes up to him. Of course, the man is very surprised to see someone on this deserted island. And the man explains that this is the way you get the finest foal, which will be born the following year. This is a breeding method on that island. But people actually have a town they live in. Sinbad goes there. He learns useful things. He engages in trade. He makes friends. They like him. And lo and behold, some months, long time after, the very ship that had sailed off after the island, which was a giant fish, did I say that? Um, the very same ship comes back. Sinbad gets on the ship, sails home with all the money he made, and stays for a while in Baghdad. So that's the first story, the first voyage, and there's similar, different kinds of adventures, but similar kinds of adventures in the succeeding six voyages.
Amazing. So it's a very fascinating story in the sense that it works on multiple levels. It's a survival tale. It's a lesson in resourcefulness. It's also kind of a bit about luck, both terrible and miraculous at the same time. You know, with the island fish and finding the tub, meeting the horse breeder. I can see why people would want to retell it for centuries. You know, it's packed with spectacle and all of that sort of thing. I'll
I really liked what you said about the Sinbad stories, and I would like to add something to that. One thing I find so interesting is that this story was originally told, the way the story was originally told. You remember that Sinbad told the adventures, Sinbad the sailor told the adventures to a poor man who had the same name, Sinbad the porter. His only tool was his body. He carried parcels for people, he carried bricks for people, heavy things, light things. He was very poor. One day, one day, he was hot, tired, hungry, and came to a bench in front of a mansion, sat down on the bench, and began musing about his poverty and the evident wealth of the person who lived in that house. And he says to himself, why are some people so poor? And why are some people so rich? And then he adds that he doesn't mean to dispute God's disposition of things in the world.
Reports confirm you are watching this video right now, but shockingly, you have not yet liked or subscribed. Please do so.
So, why does Sinbad keep getting out to sea, even though he's facing so much danger? We've asked this or explored the idea of the divine decree. Is it perhaps linked to that? He's attaching that idea of venturing out to sea, facing so much danger. Is there some kind of link or anything like that out of my own curiosity?
Well, not really. It comes down to something much simpler, at least as far as we know from the text, and that's all we have to go on. We can add a lot to it, but in the end, we have to come back to the text, and there are many different texts. For this talk, I worked on principally one of the oldest extant texts to get a feel for what it was when it started. And in that text, um, Sinbad accounts for the fact that he keeps going out to sea uh, because he forgot how bad it was out there. And that's the only time in all the seven voyages we hear why he kept going out for more.
It's so fascinating. I was actually telling a friend of mine that we were embarking upon this topic, and then he remarked to me that Sinbad is actually his favorite character, fictional character. I asked him why, and he said it's because he's just a normal man, a regular man, who's facing dangers of all sorts, and he's venturing off into the unknown. He does not know what to expect, but he's still challenging it, basically.
And
So I
that's
found that
very
interesting.
And that's very close to the way Sinbad presents himself, or that is, the author who writes Sinbad uh, has Sinbad describe himself as someone who's no different from anyone else. These things happened to him, and this is what he did, and that's what happened.
So, on that note, what kinds of monsters and strange creatures does he encounter?
the, the monsters are monsters, no doubt about it. And we don't know how tall Sinbad was, so that when he meets a giant bird, um, how big does a bird have to be giant? Well, the giant birds are big enough to pick him up and carry him from the ground up to the top of a mountain, which an eagle does, or just up to a nest or somewhere high which the rock does. Now, in terms of the giant fish in the sea, of course, one that looks like an island and has palm trees growing on its back is a product of imagination. But think about the fact of how big some of the general whales are in the ocean. A blue whale is really maybe 3 times as long as a medieval boat that sailed on the high seas. So, it's not a stretch of the imagination at all to imagine what would happen if that whale took it into his mind to attack your boat. And, of course, we know in centuries past, very recent history, there are many stories of real stories of boats being attacked by a whale. So the 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 monsters are slight exaggerations of real dangers.
It's fascinating. You know, the idea of a great big fish presenting itself as an island. You know, growing up as a child in the West and you know being attuned to fiction to some extent, I've noticed it's been reused several times in different forms of fiction. It's resonated that much. I've noticed. In
It
any
has,
case, yeah.
and I'm
Uh,
not an expert in that field. I'm learning from you, so please keep talking.
Fair enough. Fair enough. In any case, do the voyages get harder or more dangerous as the stories go?
Um, each the voyages, the interesting thing is that these voyages seem quite independent one from the other. There's not a progression that you can that jumps out of the text at you. You can always find or develop a progression, but there really isn't anything in the voyages that is progressive the way there is actually in the frame tale. But we'll talk about that a little later.
No worries at all. Um, I'm curious myself as well, since we're on the topic, which of Sinbad's adventures is your personal favorite and why?
It's actually not Sinbad's voyages that are my favorite, but the framing tale, the tale of how Sinbad tells the stories of the voyages to the poor Sinbad the porter. And all of the psychological development takes place in the frame tale. But again, we'll come back to this a little bit later. But I wanted to mention it now because there is a great contrast between the frame tale, which is psychologically sophisticated and very observant about changes being made that are taking place in the man who's listening to the stories, and the voyages, which are just one after the other. And it almost seems as though the voyages are there to make it possible to tell the frame tale.
Fascinating. Um, I think all good stories, they tend to teach something about the human condition. What I think with Sinbad, particularly, it's luck, courage, or greed, you know, those kinds of themes. So, what do you think Sinbad's stories teach us about luck, courage, or greed?
It depends whether you focus on the stories or whether you focus on the frame tale. In the stories themselves, you see things seem so unconnected, so that luck, just the happenstance of landing on a fish that's sleeping in the ocean and has been doing so for a very long time, long enough for trees to grow, um, that there's nothing that makes that happen. But in the frame tale suggests that there is no such thing as luck. It's all God's design. It's all God's purpose. And that purpose is largely unknown and unknowable to human beings, but but the but Sinbad the porter actually makes sense of all of that at the end of the frame tale, because he sees everything as God's design and God's reward for the dangers that Sinbad the sailor faced. In logical terms, it doesn't quite work, but it's great in the fiction.
Yeah, I really like how those elements are part and parcel of the original story. I was thinking about it, the concept of this big fish and how it turns out to be a big island. I was thinking, where is it most prominent? Where have I seen it before? And it turns out it's in the original Star Wars movie, George Lucas's Wars movie. Han Solo, he flies into a planet, and the planet turns out to be or asteroid or something like that, and the asteroid turns out to be a big creature of some kind. It's there basically, borrowed from Sinbad, basically.
That's funny, and that recalls something from my childhood. I remember saying once to my mother, "What what would it be like if it turned out the Earth was just a little bubble on the toe of a giant?" And I don't think that was my last significant astronomical thought. Uh, I
Yeah,
never went.
that idea actually it has been borrowed by Marvel in one of the recent Marvel movies, The Eternals.
Yeah,
They basically posit the hypothesis that the entire Earth is just like an egg, which is holding a cosmic being inside of it, and he's ready to hatch. This kind of thing.
that's wonderful.
So, in any case, back on topic. Um, this is something we've touched on, but I'm curious to know your opinion as well. Do you think Sinbad is a hero, or do you think he's just an ordinary man, ordinary person who just gets lucky?
Um, Again, we have the question of the text or how he's portrayed. In the Sinbad stories that have come down to us in traditionally in manuscripts, Sinbad is an ordinary person. Um, and that gives the story great relevance to a very broad kind of audience or audiences. But in modern renderings of it, whether filmic or in books or individual stories, I think there's such a tendency to make him into a hero who figures out how to overcome all dangers. And of course there is that marvelous one in which he lands in a I he finds himself in a plane covered with diamonds, and there are serpents. And while he's pondering this, a quarter of a sheep lands next to him, and diamonds stick to it. Presumably, these serpents are approaching. Uh, he climbs onto the sheep bit, not knowing where it came from, and is hauled up into a nest. And there are sailors who have come just for the purpose of doing what they've just done, getting diamonds to stick to this piece of meat, and then they put the diamonds in their pockets and eventually get out of there and go home with lots and lots of diamonds. Now, it was a very smart move for Sinbad to attach himself to this big piece of meat. And that's part of the story is told very differently in different tellings, in different centuries. Sometimes it's Sinbad's smartness that's the focus. Sometimes, actually, Sinbad takes all the diamonds, puts them in his own pocket before the sheep gets hauled up, and then he gives the diamonds to the merchants when he gets up to the top and gains their friendship that way, showing that a, a good attitude towards people you don't know has benefits because then they take him home on their boat. So you see, you can take any aspect of the story and you can make Sinbad into a hero or a clever man or a manipulative man, anything.
It's fascinating. So it depends on who's telling the tale, essentially.
or who they're telling it to.
So the tale was most prevalent in an era where traveling by ship was the mode of travel if you wanted to go across the ocean, obviously. So, how do these stories show the risks and rewards of travel and trade, in your opinion?
Well, of course, in every voyage, there's a shipwreck. Um, I think in every single one. And the dangers, and that was a very real danger. Wind and waves were powerful forces of nature, and so were rocks. As you near what looks like a haven, the ship might be broken apart on rocks. Um, and the dangers of unfamiliarity were others, and those, of course, are monsters. But unfamiliarity also is part of a personal danger. That is, you're meeting all kinds of people whom you don't know. They don't know you. You don't know who to trust. And so that's very hard to put into a story. But there is one part uh, then it has to do with the first voyage when that ends up working against Sinbad the sailor. Remember, I said this ship came back and he was picked up by the captain who had gone off when he saw that all the sailors had drowned and didn't know about Sinbad. Well, that captain had traded Sinbad the sailor's goods, and it was his intention to give them to Sinbad the sailor's family when he got back to Baghdad. But as he told the story of this lost sailor whose goods he had traded profitably, Sinbad said, "Oh, that's me. Those are my goods." And the captain then gives him a lecture on swindlers and how there's nowhere you can go where you can get away from people who want to take other people's goods. Eventually that gets sorted out, and that's how Sinbad returns from that first voyage with so much money.
Very interesting. It seems that there's even this inclusion of swindlers and so forth. It gives me the impression that there were intended moral lessons. So, are there moral lessons that audiences back then would have understood clearly?
Um, Audiences would have understood the moral lesson from the frame tale, which told them how to understand the stories. And that was a very big part of framed stories. That is, that the story is told by someone who starts out explaining how the story gets to be told. That's the frame tale where Sinbad the porter comes, sits down on the bench, talks about how how can some people be so poor and other people so rich? What's the reason? Um, that's the frame tale, and that's where the moral lies. In this case, within the frame tale, which means that the medieval listeners who had this frame tale told to them, you more got more of a moral lesson from it than we modern readers do when we have this individual stories without the frame tale.
What lessons do you think modern readers can take from Sinbad's journeys? You know, can they at all still take any lessons from him?
Um, I think for talking about lessons to be taken from stories, I would step back a bit and think about all stories and storytelling, and especially stories and storytelling in the family or in school. Um, while I was teaching at Princeton, I developed a way of talking about text by having two texts together, because that seeing a comparative text really focuses a reader on the differences and brings out things that you might not otherwise notice. Now, Sinbad is a perfect way to do this, and what I what I'm thinking about in response to your question is that, and, and this takes a little bit of preparation, but let's say you read one story of Sinbad to your child, and you just talked about it. Then you read another story, same story, but a different author, different presentation. Kids are so smart. They see the differences immediately. They really pursue these differences. I think that getting children to think about what they're reading and to you don't have to get them to think about it. They'll jump on it. And in a way, it often happens they become the leaders of a conversation. They ask a question, well, it's this way in this story, and it's this way in that story. Why is it different? Well, now you can go in any direction, many directions. But the most important thing is that you're having a discussion about a story and about the way words make up a story. And the words are not accidental. They're there because an author put them there. You can start talking about what's this author trying to say? Well, of course, you use the language that works for a 4-year-old or an 8-year-old or an 11-year-old. Um, but they're comparative readings, but don't ever call it that, are a wonderful opener, conversation opener with children.
Fascinating. Why do you think it is that this character gained so much prominence or became famous essentially?
Probably the because because Sinbad is presented not as a hero, but as he how to say it exactly? He's not an everyman. Sinbad the Porter is an everyman, but there's nothing that really distinguishes him. His motives for going to sea are to make money back because he squandered his inheritance. And when he goes to sea again and again, it's because we're told he's forgotten how hard it was and how dangerous. So there's nothing distinguishing about him. And 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 that means, and you'll forgive me here, please, for using um, a professional term, it's an open text. We can attribute things to Sinbad because the text doesn't say who he is. And that's a classic way to encourage readers to identify with with a character. And it's exactly what the Grimms did in editing their fairy tales. They made all the characters that they wanted children to identify with open texts, and the people they described were the witches and how they looked, uh, and what they did. And the children are just much the child characters and the good characters are very much more generally described. I think that has a lot to do with it, with why Sinbad has been so popular for such a long time.
I think you said something quite interesting earlier on. You mentioned that it was a classic paradigm of relief and suffering. And if I recall, you mentioned that it was a classic literary genre in Arabic literature.
Yes, and that genre is relief after suffering, and it's a whole type of literature, and in fact, the old medieval tales of the A Thousand and One Nights of the Arabian Nights are almost all tales of relief after suffering, and relief means if you're poor, you become the sultan's uh, companion at table. That means you get one really good meal every day. And the other relief after suffering is also a few coins. Uh, it's not the fairy tale ending that you get in an Aladdin story or European fairy tales where there's marriage to a royal queen, a king, a prince, or a princess. So that let's see.
I think you mentioned something very interesting. I think, in a sense, the prize of the story is to live another day, to have one more adventure. Basically, that's the prize. It seems, based on what you've mentioned.
Well, yes, it's not just one more day, of course, but because these adventures last months, and then he goes home and enjoys the fruits of his voyages, and then forgets and goes out again. So one more day, yes, I think putting it in that metaphoric way, yes, to live one more day.
Okay, fair enough. Obviously, these stories, they spread beyond the Middle East early on. When specifically? How late or how early did they spread?
If we think about language, the Sinbad stories were known in Turkish, and that puts them inside the history of the Ottoman Empire, which really began to its huge spread in I think it was 1517 when Ottoman forces defeated the Mamluk forces and then moved into the former Mamluk Empire, which meant the rest of the Eastern Mediterranean and all across North Africa. So the Sinbad stories were probably known in large parts of that area of the Ottoman Empire. We have one instance of a 16th century Ottoman manuscript, so that was actually put into the Thousand and One Nights. The real spread began. Well, I just want to put in one thing that you might not think of right off, and that is there were no printing presses to speak of in the Ottoman. Well, in the Mamluk, of course, there weren't in the Mamluk Empire, but at a point when books were being printed and stories were being spread by print in Europe, in the empires to the east, the Ottoman Empire, mostly the method of reproduction was still handwriting and individual scribes doing this. So once Sinbad the Sailor appeared in French in France, where there was a very lively book trade and printing trade, and in Europe as a whole, where the same thing was true, the spread wasn't instantaneous, but it was within a matter of years. Came out in 1704, translated into English in 1706, shortly thereafter, German, Dutch, and then wham, all over Europe and the Americas.
Got it. So I was wondering if you could speak a little bit more on the point of how European readers might have encountered Sinbad for the first time.
For the first time, they would have encountered it as part of the Arabia of Galland's a translation into their local language of Galland's Thousand and One Nights. And after that, because copyright laws didn't yet exist as they do now, small printers would have taken portions that they liked of a book and just reprinted it on their own. For instance, local newspapers did that sort of thing all over Europe and the Americas. So readers might have encountered Sinbad stories if they were well off in a book they had bought. If they subscribed to a local newspaper, they might actually have encountered Sinbad stories there because that reprints of that sort, even when I was a child, local newspapers had an ongoing novel, and that was simply a way that people came into contact with all kinds of fictions.
Sure. It occurs to me now that I think about it. Would it be possible to say that Jonathan Swift, the author of Gulliver's Travels, was influenced by Sinbad? Because there's some correlations there.
That's an interesting question, and the first thing I would want to do is go check out the bibliography and see what's been written, if anything, on that. And if nothing has been, then tell your friends in academe to hop on it.
Fascinating. Um, how, in your opinion, are Sinbad's tales different from other seafaring stories? You know, for example, in the Arabian Nights, there's one called Julinar of the Sea.
That's a very good point of connection. There, the Arabian Nights as a whole is not a seafaring group of it's city based and land based. The tales are city based and land based, but Julinar of the Sea is quite different from the other tales in the old manuscript. The one, in fact, that Galland used to translate Thousand and One Nights into French. Julinar of the Sea starts out with a woman named Julinar, who is a daughter of the sea. She, like her whole family, breathes underwater. Also, in a great contrast, all of the members of her family can breathe out flames. And Julinar of the Sea is also unlike most of the stories in Thousand and One Nights, in that it's about two romances, both of which end in marriage. That doesn't make it a European fairy tale, though, because in both of those love stories, the the bride enters marriage by force. In one, though I won't go into the details, but a little few details are necessary. One is captured, sold in a slave market, and taken to a king as a nice addition to his harem, and the other is the daughter of a king also, who is very independent and is extremely unwilling bride. So what it has in common is that the sea plays a role, but it only plays a role as the background or the locus for adventures by the main characters. It's not a real protagonist, doesn't wreck ships and do things like that.
Quite interesting. It occurs to me also that the tales or the stories that we're talking about, they were composed in a time before the internet, before people were able to access information. So do you think the bad stories connect to real history like trade routes or sailing to tradition so that information could be spread that way?
Very definitely. Uh, the location, although in the Sinbad stories, although the islands are unnamed, they correspond to the geography of the East Indies, and all of the islands around them, reached by long sea voyages over oceans that have many fewer islands. And then you get to this density of islands, and anthropologists studied the East Indian islands, island by island, section of island by section of island, and they were full of unknown animals, strange social customs, and this in the 20th century. What it could be imagined 7, 8, 900 years ago, you can only think for yourself. So yes, it corresponds to the reality of that world as people at that time knew it. It also draws on, and this has been studied at length, um, geographies that were written about the ancient world uh, by Indians, by Persians, by Arabs, and that those half geographies, half histories, show up in lots of other story collections as well. So it is very closely related to the real world in which real ships sailed.
Quite interesting. I think the human imagination is really at the heart of why Sinbad stories have survived for so long. On one level, they are exciting tales of adventure, full of storms, monsters, treasures, faraway lands, and so forth. All of these things, obviously, they capture the imagination of children's and even adults, right? Um, but more deeply, I think imagination allows each generation to recapture Sinbad's journeys in ways that connect with their own world. Um, what do you think is it that resonates with people when we talk about, how imagination has a role in keeping Sinbad alive, until now, essentially?
I love the way you put that your own discussion about the role of imagination and how succeeding generations imagine these tales. I couldn't have said it better myself if I had thought about it for 15 minutes. So let's leave it with your formulation. I really like it.
This sounds good. Um, do you think Sinbad should be written mainly as entertainment or as a cultural treasure? Would it be fair to put it in those terms?
I think it so the Sinbad stories function very well, both as entertainment and as part of a cultural treasure. And the entertainment we've talked about and how people can remake the story and its details so that it suits their generation, their social group, their community ideas. But it's also worth remembering that the Sinbad stories, in one particular case, by borrowing from acknowledged cultural treasures like Homer's Odyssey, uh, incorporate parts of the world's cultural treasure, which of course Homer's Odyssey is in so many ways. But by borrowing something like the one-eyed Polyphemus and the way in which Ulysses escapes by blinding him so that they can escape from he wants to eat them after all. Sinbad takes over that figure and gives it further life, almost 2,000 years, 1,000 years after after he formulated that Polyphemus figure, so that we end up having Sinbad function as part of a very much larger treasury of figures that have been drawn on generation after generation.
Fair enough. That sounds good. Um, you've used the word frame tale a couple of times, I think, in even past discussions. Could you explain perhaps what it means in the context of Sinbad and why it matters?
I really do want to share with you something that I've given a lot of thought to uh, about the frame tale, and I've mentioned that a couple of times without going into detail about the frame tales themselves, or about the frame tale of the Sinbad stories. In the medieval world, an author provided a reason for telling the stories that he was about to tell them, or she. In the Arabian Nights, Scheherazade tells stories to save her life from one day to the next. In Sinbad the Sailor stories, the frame tale begins with a desperately poor laborer carrying very heavy load down the street in Baghdad. He's exhausted and sits down on a bench in front of a mansion. Now, of course, we know this is fiction because there would never be a bench in front of a mansion. Um, And as he sits there in front of the mansion, the door of the mansion is open. Another thing that would never be the case. And from inside, he hears music. He smells food. Cool breeze from inside brings him a little bit of relief. And this is Sinbad the sailor's house. Sinbad the porter wonders aloud why some people are desperately poor and other people live in almost royal luxury. And he recites a poem that has these lines. And yet, O Lord, he's addressing God. And yet, O Lord, I do not doubt. I do not doubt thy ways, for thou art wise and just, and all judgment is thine. Sinbad the porter says these words. He's trying to understand why God, who is just and wise, allows him to suffer and poverty while the man inside the mansion lives in luxury. The man inside, Sinbad the sailor, overhears these woes, and he sends someone to invite him to come inside. He sees him at his table. He gives him food. This too is fiction, quite obviously. But it's a wonderful fiction because it works. It gets us going into the story. And Sinbad the sailor offers to tell him the story of his first voyage, and he ends his storytelling with these words. Tomorrow, the Almighty God willing, I will tell you the story of my second voyage. Now, the telling of the second voyage picks up the story from the night before. And we hear that after telling Sinbad, the porter, the story of the first voyage, Sinbad the sailor gave him 100 pieces of gold as a reward for cheering him. The porter accepts the gold, thanks Sinbad the sailor, and goes home, meditating and marveling at the events that befall mankind. That's a direct quote from the medieval telling. And he goes to sleep. The next morning, now this is the second day's telling, right? It picks up the night before, Sinbad sleeps. The next morning, the poor porter returns to Sinbad the sailor's house, is welcomed hospitably, and listens to the story of the second voyage. Once again, the story ends with Sinbad the sailor promising to tell the porter the story of the next voyage the following day. End of that part. Now we start the telling of the third voyage. The telling of the third voyage follows the same pattern of the night before. Sinbad the sailor gave the porter another 100 pieces of gold, and the language intensifies slightly this time. The porter takes the money, thanks Sinbad the sailor profusely, invokes, quote, and I quote from the medieval text, blessings on him, and goes on his way marveling at what Sinbad had suffered. Throughout the tellings of the third, fourth, fifth, sixth, and seventh voyages, the same things happen. Each time Sinbad gives the porter 100 pieces of gold. Each time Sinbad the porter marvels and over time expresses greater religious sentiment. He, quote, performed his morning prayer, quote, as soon as it was daylight, quote, as soon as it was morning, and goes to Sinbad the sailor's house, quote, as soon as he performed his morning prayers. There's a little more detail in each of these prayers. That's one per day. After Sinbad the sailor tells the story of the seventh voyage, Sinbad the porter says, the listener says, and I quote again from the medieval story, for God's sake, pardon me the wrong I did you. The wrong? The wrong, of course, is the porter's having questioned why he, the porter, lives in miserable poverty, while Sinbad the sailor lives in ease and luxury. After telling the story of the seventh voyage, Sinbad the sailor makes Sinbad the porter his table companion, and the story ends with these words: "And they continued to enjoy their fellowship and their friendship in all cheer and joy until there came to them death, the destroyer of delights, the sunderer of companies." Sorry, I'm going to do that again. I couldn't see that. "And they continued to enjoy their fellowship and their friendship in all cheer and joy until there came to them death, the destroyer of delights, the sunderer of companies, the wrecker of palaces, and builder of tombs." That's a more elaborate way of finishing than most of the endings of stories in the Arabian Nights, by the way, um, where it becomes just a formula. They had all these pleasures until the destroyer came and ended.
That's actually referencing Islamic texts. The Prophet, peace be upon him, used to refer to death as Hadimul Laddat, the destroyer of pleasures. So it's actually referencing Islamic texts or literature.
And interestingly, showing the closeness of the Sinbad stories, it happens in greater detail. This acknowledgement of death's effect than it does in the Arabian Nights. I thought that was interesting.
It is. It's very fascinating.
These final words make the Sinbad tales a classic Arab tale, but in this case, with the extra benefit of educating Sinbad the porter. And so the Sinbad cycle participates in world literature in yet another way as a Bildungsroman, the German term for a novel of education of the hero, as a Bildungsroman. And it does this centuries before this genre developed in Europe, which is also a, a very interesting uh, viewpoint of the Sinbad stories, which I haven't seen in discussions of it. It's a really fascinating group of tales. Bears a lot of thinking about. And thank you, Furkan, for providing this opportunity to do so and to share some of my thoughts with your listeners and followers.
Thank you very much. So you've basically given us a good idea as to why this full cycle of Sinbad voyages, what makes them stand out and how they're not necessarily just adventure tales, but there's an element of growth and education in there as well, I suppose.
Yes, indeed. Thank you very much. I've enjoyed being with you.
Thank you very much. Just as we close, I wanted to ask you a final question. You've studied fairy tales and storytelling for years. Do you have a personal favorite story that you just go back to for enjoyment?
Okay. I don't really. I I find the fairy tales throw so many questions at me that I spend most of my time thinking about why they're written the way they are written. And I I have not I don't have. No, that's not true. That's not true. There is one fairy tale that I find particularly fascinating, but it's unfortunately one that is very little known, even though it's by Charles Perrault. And no, Furkan, I can't talk about it because I haven't got it clearly enough in my mind. So we might just, it's not a question I really can answer.
That's okay. All right. I do want to ask one light-toned question, if I may be able to do so. Um, you know, if you could step into a fairy tale or folklore world for a day, which one would you most like to experience, or which one would you most like to avoid at all costs?
Oh, my. It must be very limiting, but I've never, ever thought of doing that. I maybe I don't know.
Fair enough. Perhaps we can think about a return to that one at some point in the future. Uh, in any case, thank you for your time. I really appreciated this, and I'm sure some of the listeners, or many of the listeners, would have appreciated this. And I thank you for your time, and thank you for staying up with us. I imagine it's quite late over there, and I appreciate it. Good luck with all the future research as well, and look forward to hearing more from you in the future.
Thank you very much.